The World Malaria Report of 2016 summarized progress towards the 2020 malaria goals of the Global Technical Strategy for Malaria. However, across Africa, millions of people still lack access to the tools they need to prevent and treat the disease. Funding shortfalls and fragile health systems restrict access to life-saving interventions and jeopardizes the attainment of global targets. According to the report, fewer than half of the 91 malaria-affected countries and territories are on track to achieve the 2020 milestone of a 40% reduction in case incidence and mortality. In 2015, malaria financing totaled $2.9 billion. Experts say contributions from both domestic and international sources must increase substantially if the Global Technical Strategy for Malaria of 2016 to 2030 is to be achieved. Well, Discovery Channel is to release a documentary called The Mosquito, and the South African office has positioned malaria as the next worldwide pandemic. To discuss, I have with me Professor John Freen, Deputy Director of the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us. Discovery Channel here in South Africa, like I mentioned, positioned malaria as the next worldwide pandemic. To what extent is that true?
Well, I think it's being a bit alarmist. If we look at progress in malaria control worldwide since 2000, there have been substantial improvements. And this is due to a lot of money being provided by donors, with the efforts coordinated by various global malaria control bodies like the WHO. So in fact, Africa, although it's still really the hotbed of malaria in the world, we've seen substantial reductions in mortality.
Yes, as reported.
As mentioned there,
Yeah.
up to 40% since 2000. There is still some way to go, and the WHO has set what seem to be possibly ambitious targets. But I think we need to distinguish between elimination, which is where most countries are heading for or targeting, as opposed to eradication. And there's a distinct difference between those two concepts. South Africa itself is targeting elimination in the very near future, which means no local transmission of the disease. It doesn't mean the parasite will disappear from the face of the earth, but it means the countries will be free of the burden of locally transmitted malaria.
Yeah, it's been common knowledge here in Southern Africa that AIDS and TB are major causes of deaths as well. How does AIDS and TB compare to malaria?
Well, in terms of numbers of people, malaria is really a very small problem for South Africa. We've got substantial problems with those other diseases. On average, over the last 10 years or so, we only have about 10,000 notified malaria cases per year, and maybe up to 75 or 80 deaths per year. The situation just recently has rebounded somewhat, and we've had substantial outbreaks in Limpopo and Mpumalanga provinces. But that's probably off a low base from last year, where transmission was down because of the drought. So we're probably getting back to more the expected levels.
So you say Limpopo and Mpumalanga are the malaria-prone areas in South Africa specifically. Why is that?
The ecology and climate and so on suit the vector very well, and they're next to countries with large malaria-infected populations, and there's a lot of trans-border migration of people, which contributes to the malaria burden in our country. But we have a very successful malaria control program, and that's what's pushing us in the direction of elimination within the next few years.
Sure, very interesting. And when we're talking about malaria, TB, AIDS, these are communicable diseases, right?
Yes.
Okay, because it's interesting that the WHO has also pointed out that heart disease and strokes, they say, are by far the leading cause of death worldwide. Plus, they say antibiotic resistance is increasing at an alarming rate. So again, how does that compare to mosquito-borne diseases according to your knowledge? Again, challenging the position taken by this documentary, which is really, from their perspective, a campaign to spread the awareness around malaria.
It depends where you look. There have been major epidemics of mosquito-borne diseases elsewhere in the world. Dengue, chikungunya, and most recently Zika virus have all been in the headlines. But in terms of our susceptibility in southern Africa, we seem to be less likely to get those major epidemics, or even pandemics, you could call them. They're really not, our situation doesn't seem to suit the transmission of those diseases, mainly related to suitable vectors, but also, general environmental and social conditions.
What would you say is South Africa's future burden of mosquito-related diseases, and how does that again compare to other parts of Africa or the world?
Well, malaria is probably our priority at the moment, but we do have other mosquito-borne diseases, certain viruses, a group called the arbor viruses, which are transmitted by mosquitoes other than the malaria vectors. And from time to time we may get outbreaks of certain of them, for example, one called Rift Valley fever. That's mainly a veterinary problem, and humans are really incidentally affected by that. But in general, we've escaped, or we're not likely to get the massive epidemics of dengue, of chikungunya, and of Zika that the documentary emphasizes.
Are there any new revelations that could shed more light on fighting malaria in Africa?
Well, I think the documentary was obviously aimed at a general audience, and I think may have been a bit melodramatic in some instances. But one of the points they made was that climate change may influence the ability of mosquitoes to spread and transmit certain diseases. It's not altogether clear that it'll always be necessarily bad. For example, some areas may become hotter and drier and less suitable for vectors, whereas other areas, as has been shown in Kenya, malaria has expanded its geographic distribution, most likely due to climate change. But I think many populations, as we've seen with Zika, are susceptible to new introductions of pathogens, or ones that they haven't experienced before. And they may be able to spread very quickly in populations, as we saw.
Sure, I think the one thing the documentary points out is that mosquitoes have been with us throughout human existence. For centuries, mosquitoes have been with us. So again, the question is, if we are referring to any dangers of climate change impacting on that, how new is this information, given that it's been everywhere across the world, even during Roman times in Europe?
Well, I think what's changed is mobility of humans. Whereas before people didn't travel in large numbers, whereas we have huge numbers going from place to place nowadays. And that really facilitates the introduction of new infections into areas where they haven't been seen before.
Despite the fact that they may have taken an alarmist approach in terms of positioning it as the next worldwide pandemic, do you think that this campaign could impact positively on the state of malaria?
Well, I think public education and awareness is very important. People understanding what their risks are and how they can, what precautions they can take to prevent malaria, I think is always good. And yes, people do need to know about diseases of importance in other parts of the world for planning their holidays and so on, and for not taking unnecessary risks. The point about Zika in pregnancy is emphasized in the movie, about how pregnant women or women planning to become pregnant need to be aware of those risks. So I think this sort of educational thing is important.